winds southwest, 12 to 20 in the morning, increasing 15 to 25 after 1100, and gusting up to 35 miles per hour on ridges.
I think what happened in those years, the foresters thought they were doing the right thing by keeping fire out of these ecosystems because they were trying to protect the trees. The result was losing that resource, and I can think of several examples of fires around Yosemite where they kept fire out, and the fire that eventually came through burned down all the trees that were there. So by doing what they thought was right, they ended up losing what they were trying to protect.
We were creating a situation that we're setting the stage for potentially catastrophic wildfire, for fires that were going to become much larger, much more intense, and threaten the communities that we decide to settle into and live in. And so what do you do about that? Who is willing to take on and shoulder the risk of applying fire to a landscape when it's been pumped into you from day one that fire is bad?
I think when you're dealing with something that is as potentially dangerous as fire and has its place in history of human civilization as being a destructive force, you can't forget those stories. You can't forget that fire is an awesome force of nature.
The only image I've ever seen on TV of a wildfire is this big crown fire. It's racing up the hill, 200-foot flame lengths, homes burning up, just mayhem and chaos. Whereas in actuality, like 90% of the time, it's just really creeping. You can outcrawl a fire. It's low flame lengths, not doing anything but good.
Beautiful day to be gathered here in the park. I'm Taro Pusina. I'm the prescribed fire and fuel specialist here in Yosemite National Park. I'll be the burn boss for this incident today. Mariposa Grove is a very special place. It's one of the main reasons that Yosemite Park was originally founded. And the reason that we do burning up here in the Grove is to try to mimic what natural fire would have done here historically. And by natural, I mean lightning-caused fires.
In the fourth year of America's bloody Civil War, few people took notice when the president signed a bill preserving 60 square miles of California wilderness. In signing the Yosemite Grant, Abraham Lincoln marked the first time in Western history that a government set aside land purely to protect its scenic beauty for everyone to enjoy. Yosemite Valley, along with this grove of giant sequoias, suddenly belonged to all Americans, and it was our government's responsibility to protect them. This was a new idea, and with no precedent to guide them, Yosemite's early managers did what made sense. Their job was to protect some of the largest living things on Earth, and that meant keeping one obvious enemy well away from what was now a national treasure.
Well, I think the first park managers honestly felt that fire would destroy this gem of the sequoias, the whole reason we founded Yosemite National Park, or one of them. So by keeping fire out of the sequoia and the rest of the park, we were essentially protecting the grove, saving this gem, this treasure.
Because they felt the best way to protect the grove was to build a road around it so that they could keep fires out of the grove. And that was pretty much the Park Service's view for decades after that they wanted to keep all fires out of the grove to protect the trees.
In 1899, a USGS report declared fire's effects were always evil, without a single redeeming feature. Looking at the effect wildfires had on communities, this made sense. As for the health of the forest, the logic seemed obvious. Everyone knew fires destroyed forests, so protecting our public lands meant stopping fire whenever possible. As more Americans moved west and larger fires got more attention, the battle against wildfire grew into an all-out war. On the front lines were thousands of firefighters, and backing them was a nation quick to label fire as the enemy.
That was the beginning of the fire prevention program that eventually evolved into Smokey Bear, one of the most identifiable add icons that exist. I think more people know Smokey the Bear than Ronald McDonald.
My dad had the Smokey the Bear picture book, and you know, he was reading me the story, and I would see, you know, as a kid, I'm looking and all I'm seeing is a little bear cub with his paws bandaged from hanging onto the tree and being burned, and shows the desolate pictures of the burned out forest.
Fire was evil. We had to stop it before it destroyed our precious forests. By mid-century, America's fire crews were working to put out every reported wildfire before 10 a.m. the next day. The fight was on, and at least in some places, we appeared to be winning. In the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias, looking back through the centuries, lightning strikes had started fires in the grove every few years until the mid-1800s, when Yosemite's managers began stopping these fires in order to protect the trees. What happened next was not what those managers expected.
Crew 7 is also assigned to the Mariposa Grove burn. Resource advisor today is Jen Hook. Pumpkin time, 18:48 hours. 6 minutes for safety topic is the spot weather forecast. Break.
Today, after more than a century of keeping fire away from these trees, why are Yosemite's managers intentionally starting a fire in the middle of the Mariposa Grove?
Well, this is a test fire. We do this before we commence any prescribed fire, and that's mostly just a ground truth, see if we're actually going to get kind of what we expect.
If we conducted this test burn and noticed that the fire was starting to creep up and get into the ladder fuels and carry up into the canopies, we would probably have to shut down because we know it's only going to get warmer and drier as the day progresses.
By the 1960s, a century had passed since Abraham Lincoln first set aside this grove. During that time, the National Park Service kept all fires away from these precious trees. But looking around the grove, it was clear that something was wrong. All the ancient sequoias remained as we had found them, but young sequoias were few and far between. Despite our protection, or perhaps because of it, the next generation of trees was largely missing. What Yosemite's early managers failed to realize when labeling fire as the enemy was that the sequoias, like many other species, actually depend on fire. Wildfire wasn't threatening the trees. It was the opposite. By keeping fire out of the grove, we were actually making it harder for the trees to reproduce.
Giant sequoias are particularly well adapted to fire. The cones at the top of the tree will open on a hot day, but if you get a fire that burns underneath the stand, most of the cones will open and the seeds drop out. Once the seeds fall out, they need to land on mineral soil in order for this seedling to become established. So, you know, the combination then of a fire burning through, burning the fuels from the ground, creating the mineral soil, having the heat go up into the canopy of the tree, opening the cones, and the seeds then fall down on the mineral soil.
The fire kind of acts more like a vacuum cleaner, if you will. It helps kind of clean up the forest floor and actually reduces some of the smaller trees as well.
Well, if you look at before and after pictures of the grove, it used to be much more open in the understory on the ground. You could see and walk for much greater distances without all of what we call dog hair thickets of dense understory underbrush.
With fires would come through and take out the smaller trees, would reduce the fuels that were on the ground, and would generally clean up the forest so the fire that did come through was not as intense.
Certain areas in the park you can't even walk, you know, it's just choked with so many little cedars, like you can't get through them, you know, and tons and tons of ground fuels.
Suddenly the problem stood out like a sore thumb. Without fire to open their cones and clear the forest floor, Yosemite sequoias were fighting an uphill battle. By excluding fire, we had fundamentally altered the forest we were trying to preserve.
The Sierra Nevada probably looked, and these are words that the early explorers used, open, park-like is the cliche. You could ride a horse through the forest for days without having any problems at all. And that's a result of the fires that burn through there regularly. And we have several methods we use to determine that. And one of the primary ones is to look at fire scars in cores of trees. And from the core, then you'll see fire scars in the tree rings. And from that you can tell how often that particular area would have burned naturally. So we can say if fire burned here every 10 years, historically, and we've been putting fires out for 100 years, that's probably 10 fires that this particular system has missed.
As it turned out, the plight of Yosemite sequoias was only the tip of the iceberg. By the time foresters realized what was going on, America had been excluding fire across the country for almost a century. The result was, and in many areas still is, a tinderbox just waiting to burn.
We were shooting ourselves in the foot. If you leave all that fuel on the ground and increase the density of the understory, a fire will come through and actually rage through and take out the trees that the previous fires protected.
It goes back to the suppression for the last 100 years, just because you have all of these different layers, vertical layers in the forest now, from the ground up to the tops of trees. And so once you get a little flame on the ground, and it can crawl up a little seedling, and then up higher and higher, and once it gets wind and heat on it, and it has that available fuel from different layers, it just starts ripping.
A-Rock, Steamboat, Ackerson. These and other unusually destructive fires ripped through Yosemite as recently as 1996, fueled by the very trees we had so carefully protected. By excluding fire from our forests, we broke a natural cycle. On its face, the problem looks relatively simple. The solution, however, is not. We've stacked the deck against ourselves. Our forests are now choked with fuel, dead wood, brush, tightly packed young trees, all just waiting to burn, and burn far more intensely than they would have had we never intervened. Continuing to exclude all fires only makes the problem worse. On the other hand, after a century of excluding fire, if we simply walk away and let all lightning fires burn uncontrolled, the results could be catastrophic.
I don't think the question is to burn or not to burn. I think the question is pay me now or pay me later is another cliche, because it will burn. We know it will burn, and there's nothing we can do about that.
As foresters began to see the problem we had created by excluding fire, one thing became clear. We needed to figure out a way to live with fire instead of fighting against it. There was no simple solution that could turn back the clock, but by using what we had learned from fighting fire, perhaps we could slowly dig ourselves out of the hole we had created. Starting in the 70s, Yosemite's managers broke stride with traditional firefighting practices and began carefully allowing some natural wildfires to burn. Today, in much of the park's designated wilderness, fires like this one, started by a lightning strike near Frog Creek, are allowed to run their course within careful limits.
Right, we're working in an area now where your safety zone is probably going to be this black for the Wapama fire over here. It's very important that this fire continue to be a success. Again, I think we're getting a lot of good ecological benefit. We're still in planning level 5.
When July thunderstorms started this fire, Yosemite's managers looked at the fire history for the Frog Creek area and saw the benefits that would result from allowing a natural fire to burn.
Its location was away from developed areas, and the weather parameters were all right in line with the type of fire effects that we wanted to see in the wilderness.
This section right here is your safety zone. Safety.
The idea is to carefully use lightning fires to slowly piece back together Yosemite's natural fire cycle. Though the goal here is not to stop this fire, the tactics firefighters use to control it are the same tactics learned from suppressing fire. Technology makes the job safer and at times easier. But the most effective ways to control fire are still the same as when Yosemite's first managers began protecting Mariposa Grove. Clearing a strip of ground or fire line in advance of a fire creates a break, hopefully stopping the fire where we want. Many such breaks already exist: rivers, trails, roads, open granite, and most important, areas that have already burned.
When you have that patchwork mosaic of natural fires out in the landscape, subsequent fires can't go as far. They can't build up as much intensity. They're going to be smaller in size. They're going to be less intense because they're going to run into a recent burn and either stop altogether or drop down out of the crowns and essentially go to ground and just clean up the deadened down material from the last burn.
They'll burn for 4 or 5 months. People are like, 4 or 5 months? That's your normal fire, is it doesn't move very fast and low intensity. It's not like this whole uniform just wipe out everything. It's kind of a mosaic. You'll have patches within the perimeter of the fire that hasn't burned. It still has the leaves and the litter. And you'll have areas that have like totally torched out the canopy. You know, it's just this nice little patchwork.
Using this patchwork of naturally burned areas as a collection of fire breaks, today's fire managers are slowly piecing back together the natural balance that we originally altered. This process is slow, however, and it involves the challenge of herding fires away from some areas and toward others.
We made a conscious choice to actually hold the fire to the north side of Frog Creek and not let it burn to the south side of Frog Creek.
It's really great that the fire is moving in here and cleaning up a lot of this deadened down material, but the fire up in these snags is creating a spotting source, and we're getting spotting across the line. What we're trying to do is to take this line just on down to Frog Creek, and then the fire can make its way up north unimpeded.
Some people think that just because we have a wilderness fire, we're not out there and we're not managing it. Yes, we are managing it, and in this particular case, we wanted to make sure we managed it to reduce smoke impacts to communities.
Smoke. It's the way most of us experience wildfire. Rarely do we get to see the actual flames of a forest fire, but one fire can affect thousands or millions of people with its smoke.
If our goal is to allow natural fires to run their course and allow these ecosystems to function naturally, we butt up against some other society values. We live in a bigger world. There are other values that are important to society that conflict with that goal of achieving total naturalness. And society has deemed that smoke is bad, and therefore if you're allowing fires to burn and producing smoke, then you're responsible for the effects that smoke might have on other communities.
Smell it, but surprisingly, I have only had one constituent call and complain, despite the fact that this has gone on for weeks and weeks and weeks now.
Even the low-level intensity smoke is causing people to get irritated over a period of time.
Yeah.
The dilemma that we're in is trying to balance the ecosystem needs of having fire on the landscape along with the human needs of the desire not to be impacted by smoke.
Naturally, there would have been smoke, all summer long, and we're maintaining this artifact of no smoke for public health reasons, but also for visibility reasons. And people complain when they can't see Half Dome on a smoky day, but they don't complain if they can't see Half Dome on a foggy day. We pick on fire because we can. It is a force that we thought we could control. Should we bring in big fans and blow out the fog so people can see Half Dome? No. Should we put out fires that are burning naturally so people can see Half Dome? I think not. I think we need to accept the natural world as it presents itself, particularly in national parks, which are supposed to be places where people can see their natural heritage, not a cultural artifact.
Public health, air quality, forest health, safety, cost, politics. The questions faced by today's fire crews are far more complex than those that faced Yosemite's first managers. But looming behind this balancing act is the simple truth that ignoring the problem will only make matters worse. 4 months after lightning struck this tree and started the Frog Creek fire, it continues to slowly move northward, restoring this area back to what it might have looked like before we began putting fires out. Using lightning fires in this way to inch our forests back toward a more natural state makes sense in a wilderness setting. But in more developed areas or near landmarks we're not willing to jeopardize, allowing natural fires is often just too risky. These areas still need to burn, but we want them to burn on our terms.
Jim, the results of test burn are favorable. We're going to continue on. We've got about a half of an acre.
I copy test results favorable, and you're going to continue with ignition. Half an acre, 931.
When Yosemite's managers realized in the 1960s that they should not have been excluding fire from this grove of giant sequoias, they faced a dilemma. Fire would benefit the grove, but the trees were too precious to risk allowing natural fires into the area, especially now that the grove was overgrown after a century without fire. One idea was to clear the overgrown forest ourselves, or mechanically thin the understory. Where fire is just too dangerous to allow, fire crews still use this option. But it can be extremely expensive, and in the end, it's only a partial fix. From an ecological standpoint, what these forests need is to actually burn. The solution came from a group of scientists who were willing to push an idea that went counter to everything firefighters were used to doing. We'll light the grove on fire ourselves.
Because this is a prescribed fire. Some people call it controlled fire. We just have a set area that we want to burn, and we want to keep the fire in that area. So the main thing, you want to usually just start at the upper end of the unit, establish a black, what they call a black line, across the top, let that cool down, and then you kind of run strips below that, and just keep deepening it and taking it all the way down to the bottom. If you light from the bottom, it's going to race up, fire likes to race uphill, and then it'll torch out the trees and the canopy. So there is a rhyme and reason. It's almost an art form.
The idea of prescribed fire is based on our need to find a compromise. There are some areas that we know need to burn, but we want to control exactly how they burn and under what conditions. Yosemite's fire crew has been planning this burn for months, waiting until this fall day when conditions are just right for a safe but still effective burn. Leading up to the fire, crews kept careful track of weather patterns, watching and waiting for the right opportunity or window in which to light the fire.
The temperature has to be within a certain range. Relative humidity and winds also have to be in a certain range. The wind direction is very important. That determines where the smoke will go and how the fire will behave. And only when all of those parameters are met and within our narrow windows can we go ahead and proceed to light the match.
Last hour. And the winds are light, 1 to 2 from the southwest. How do you copy?
So the idea is to have the best chance for success as opposed to fire during the worst times of the summer when it's too hot and dry.
Winds out of the south, 2 to 4, gust to 7, dry bulb 63, wet bulb 49, RH 40. PI for an exposed slope 30, shaded also 30.
Once the fire is lit, by monitoring weather conditions and carefully containing the burn, Yosemite's crew strikes a balance, allowing the grove to benefit from a much-needed burn, while enabling us to rest assured that our national treasure won't be harmed. Throughout the day, crews continue lighting different sections of the grove, slowly working fire through the giant sequoias at a pace that we determine.
All of these plants in this type of forest system rely on fire, so we're trying to help clean up a little bit of this understory and bring it back to its, normal, natural, healthy state.
Unlike the Frog Creek fire, which burned for over 4 months before fall rains finally put it out, this prescribed fire burns for only a few days, then quietly smolders for barely a week before predicted showers start the winter season. Next year, Yosemite's fire crew will ignite another section of this same grove, slowly restoring the natural fire cycle with which these giant sequoias originally evolved.
Some of the early park managers maybe didn't have the benefit of science to base their decisions on when it came to managing fire. The only thing they knew was fire suppression, and they felt honestly that that was the right thing to do. They were saving the forest, they were saving lives and property and whatever else, and honestly felt they were doing the right thing.
Ironically, by lighting these burns, Yosemite's fire crew is continuing the effort first started by those who fought to keep fire out of this grove. They were doing their jobs with the best of intentions. And now, after learning from their experiences, we're continuing to do the same.
As much as we know about fire systems in the Sierra, we realize that there's still a lot to learn. And part of science is profiting from mistakes. That in itself guides us and informs informs our scientific method, that we have to keep coming back and revisiting the assumptions that we've made. So there's never an end to this. It's a process that makes you understand that you have to come at it with a humble curiosity. The alternatives could be catastrophic.
That fire would destroy this gem of the sequoias, the whole reason we founded Yosemite National Park, or one of them. So by keeping fire out of the sequoia and the rest of the park, we were essentially protecting the grove, saving this gem, this treasure.
Because they felt the best way to protect the grove was to build a road around it so that they could keep fires out of the grove. And that was pretty much the Park Service's view for decades after that, they wanted to keep all fires out of the grove to protect the trees.
In 1899, a USGS report declared fire's effects were always evil, without a single redeeming feature. Looking at the effect wildfires had on communities, this made sense. As for the health of the forest, the logic seemed obvious. Everyone knew fires destroyed forests, so protecting
cause fires.
In the fourth year of America's bloody Civil War, few people took notice when the president signed a bill preserving 60 square miles of California wilderness. In signing the Yosemite Grant, Abraham Lincoln marked the first time in Western history that a government set aside land purely to protect its scenic beauty for everyone to enjoy. Yosemite Valley, along with this grove of giant sequoias, suddenly belonged to all Americans, and it was our government's responsibility to protect them. This was a new idea, and with no precedent to guide them, Yosemite's early managers did what made sense. Their job was to protect some of the largest living things on Earth, and that meant keeping one obvious enemy well away from what was now a national treasure.
Well, I think the first park managers honestly felt
100-foot flame lengths, homes burning up, just mayhem and chaos. Whereas in actuality, like 90% of the time, it's just really creeping. You could outcrawl a fire, it's low flame lengths, not doing anything but good.
Beautiful day to be gathered here in the park. I'm Taro Pusina. I'm the prescribed fire and fuel specialist here in Yosemite National Park. I'll be the burn boss for this incident today. Mariposa Grove is a very special place. It's one of the main reasons that Yosemite Park was originally founded. And the reason that we do burning up here in the grove is to try to mimic what natural fire would have done here historically. And by natural, I mean lightning.
The ridge winds southwest, 12 to 20 in the morning, increasing 15 to 25 after 1100 and gusting up to 35 miles per hour on ridges.
I think what happened in those years, the foresters thought they were doing the right thing by keeping fire out of these ecosystems because they were trying to protect the trees. The result was losing that resource, and I can think of several examples of fires around Yosemite where they kept fire out, and the fire that eventually came through burned down all the trees that were there. So by doing what they thought was right, they ended up losing what they were trying to protect.
We were creating a situation that we're setting the stage for potentially catastrophic wildfire, for fires that were going to become much larger, much more intense, and threaten the communities that we decide to settle into and live in. And so what do you do about that? Who is willing to take on and shoulder the risk of applying fire to a landscape when it's been pumped into you from day one that fire is bad?
I think when you're dealing with something that is as potentially dangerous as fire and has its place in history of human civilization as being a destructive force, you can't forget those stories. You can't forget that fire is an awesome force of nature.
The only image I've ever seen on TV of a wildfire is this big crown fire. It's racing up the hill, 200